Hi, and welcome to Court. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sasha de Boyle, Director of the Court International Festival of Literature, and I'm really excited to be introducing you to our first ever digital festival. I hope you enjoyed this event, and if you do, why not take a moment to see what else we have in store online at court.ie. All our events will be broadcast live until the 25th of April, but if you want to watch or listen again, you can find them all online on our website, our SoundCloud, or our YouTube channel. Please feel free to join the conversation on social media. We'll be using the hashtag Court2020 across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram throughout the weekend. If you'd like to make a donation to support Court, you can do so at court.ie/support us. And after the event, we'll be sending out a post-event survey and would be very grateful if you were able to fill this in. We can't be there with you, but we hope we can bring a little of the Court spirit to you wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us online this evening for our interview with Eimear McBride. Eimear McBride was born in Liverpool in 1976 to Irish parents. Her family moved back to Ireland when she was 3, and she spent her childhood in Tubbercurry, Sligo and Mayo. At the age of 17, she moved to London to begin her studies at the Drama Centre, and she wrote her first novel, the acclaimed A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, in just 6 months at the age of 27. 9 years later, the independent Galley Beggar Press of Norwich published it, and it went on to win the inaugural 2013 Goldsmiths Prize and the 2014 Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, amongst others. Her second novel, The Lesser Bohemians, which was published in 2016, won the Tait Memorial Prize and was shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize and the RSL Encore Award. Her latest novel, Strange Hotel, was published earlier this year, and we are going to start with a reading from that novel. Our conversation will last approximately half an hour, and Eimear will do another reading a little bit later on in our conversation. So Eimear, would you like to introduce the section you're going to read from now?
Yes, hi, thanks, Adele. So I'm going to read from Strange Hotel, obviously, and the section I've chosen is first when the protagonist goes to Prague. There are more cobbles down there than you could ever wish for, she thinks. No wonder defenestration was a thing. She has no doubt if each could speak, their mouths would yawn fantastic with history. But in truth, hers is a beggared interest. Missives from antiquity are not why she's here, and if more rigorous motives yet remain unclear, she is at peace with that. She can be and can choose to be in any given place. Furthermore, she's a grown woman, and no body exists to which she must report back on every instant. Too much, already too much of that. Far too much, she thinks, her scorn rising at the redundant aegis of her instincts. All she really wants is the dark behind her eyes, and perhaps for the rain to relent. Unfortunately, with neither appearing imminent, in the short term she must take solace in her cigarette. In with pleasure, out with smoke. Not exactly how the saying goes. Illustrative, certainly. In the medium term she may contemplate those cobblestones unfurling across the ways and alleys for as far as she can see. And from the well-placed height she is, she can see quite far. She plans to remain in the short and medium term as long as she can, because if there is a longer term, it would be news to her. That said, she'd welcome any indication of his presence, intimating, as it surely would, some part of her knows something of what she does. But unedified by this insight, she attempts to shake it off, while still maintaining some appreciation that it is most likely true. True too, however, and equally so, is that the tiny balcony she finds herself outside on now is almost open to the elements. She hadn't bargained on that before stepping out. Glass panels, she'd assumed, secured all within from without. They form window walls on either side, pressed into the concrete, and to be sure ivied, but seemingly sturdy enough. Only a lip at the front edge. Only a lip at the front edge, though, where panes must have been. Where have they disappeared off to, then? Might they have fallen out, causing chaos on the streets, making the city dream again of Hussites or Catholics? More prosaically, they've probably been taken in for repair. Negligent, she thinks, allowing guests access out here when between the inner sliding door and eternity, There's little more than a thin brass rail. Had she known this was the state of play, she'd certainly have stayed in. Careless of her not to check, especially with the heavens already disgorging themselves all over everywhere. On reflection, that solitary canker-black ficus should have given her pause. But then, who in this climate tries to grow one of those outdoors? Realistically, if she'd noticed, she'd probably have blamed the fag ends in its pot. The verdegreed rail should also have prompted some thoughts, but no matter now, any of this, as her bare back shivers in the stark, solid sheet, which her fingers entangle as rope. She should really go in and get a few clothes on, or at least step back from the looming inundation down a hair's breadth from her nose. That is all quite right, and she should do that. Take either option, or both, if she feels like it. She hesitates instead. And then the second piece I'd like to read is from Austin. There we go. She opens the door. He says, "Can I come in?" She closes the door again. He manages a "hold on" before it shuts, but she, weightless in the width of shock, replaces the chain and turns the lock, then listens for his footfalls away. Upon hearing none, she admits harbouring some doubt that she would. So now, although she cannot be certain, she may reasonably deduce he is devising an alternative approach. She already knows she's miscalculated the outcome of this, and given her natural antipathy towards inconclusiveness, is irritated by having gotten it wrong. Also, and almost worse, where is the unrufflable demeanour she so painstakingly constructed? She'd appreciate it reasserting itself now. This angst is pointless, though, and wasteful too. Take a breath. Wait a beat. Self-reproach is a luxury for which she manifestly does not have the time. She really ought to be getting on with spreading the logic around. An untender resolve now is obviously all. Settle on the parameters of the decision, then make the choice. Even the wrong one would be preferable to this stalled botch. And if the scale of it appears unmanageable, just start small. Compartmentalize. She is already accomplished in this department after all, and may rely on it to stand her in good stead. So, should she spy through this spy hole? She has little stomach for that. The queasy, fish-eyed reflection of her own anxious perspective. Also, she thinks she recalls a mention of his fondness for chess, not ostentatiously announced, but in reference to something else. So any such hackneyed move will have been anticipated, unquestionably. Perhaps he even banks on it. She can't really imagine why, although he has certainly gone very quiet out there. In fact, now the only sounds filtering through seem to issue from the housekeeping staff beyond in the hall. Trolleys trundling, for instance, distant discreet raps upon doors, apologies in various Latin accents of whose particular origin she remains unsure. Why didn't she study Spanish at school? Well, because it was only French, and even the French teacher had appeared unenthusiastic about imparting it. Never mind. It was the tenses she could never get. Never mind. And the numbers above 60. Who can keep track of all that? Never mind. The education system isn't on trial. Never mind. It doesn't matter. She's here now, so think. What is the reaction he might not expect? Well, and she realizes this is weak, but in her graceless desperation it's something at least, and in this way a decision gets made. So, to thwart whatever advantage he imagines he's gained by his intemperate, unwarranted, overzealous display, she definitively turns her back on the spy hole and presses her spine to the wood. She is aware, as a countermove, this isn't much use, but in light of the previous paralysis, its impact is enormous. She could finally approve breathing out, and does, and looks around. Not a great deal of this room rejoins her to calm. She persists, however, until quiet confidence arrives that she might, if only at some obtuse angle, have regained the upper hand. And if he doesn't realize she has, well, surely that's just greater proof. Take your triumphs where you find them, she thinks, especially when the thick of battle appears to be your only alternative. A little melodramatic, perhaps, but she gets her own point, and therefore lets the time slow down, sheathes the panic back under her skin, becomes a little more of herself again, and lets the room be what it is.
I feel like that's where the applause should be. So, um, people who haven't read the book will have got from that reading alone that you're talking about a woman. She's anonymous and she goes to various different locations around the world and stays in hotels. Can you tell me a little bit about why you wanted to write a novel in this setting, and particularly about an anonymous woman, even though we get to know her obviously a bit throughout the book?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in some ways the anonymity was perhaps a return to girl as a half woman thing, the idea of how little you need to tell a reader in order for them to understand. I quite like the kind of the challenge of that. Um, and and then also, hotel rooms are those kind of odd liminal places where people can exist outside their everyday life and and yet at the same time are thrown back upon them on their own resources because there's nothing to distract. It's not like, we're all stuck in our houses here on lockdown and there's lots of, oh, I must, water the flowers or clean the cupboard, or, when you're in a hotel, you're there and there's nothing of yourself in it. And so the kind of the idea of sorting through the self rises to the surface and becomes a bit less avoidable.
And when did you get the idea to write about that? Was it through your own experience of hotels? Because I presume as an author, you must travel a lot and you must be in a lot of different hotels. Did the idea come to you as simply as that, or was there something else behind it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have been in a lot of hotels in the last few years, and uh, it feels, when you first to stay in hotels, which was something I had never done before I was published. I could have counted on the fingers of one hand how many hotels I'd stayed in my life. Um, it seemed very glamorous. It was quite exciting, and you kind of go in and see what are the free toiletries and is there a mini bar and all that kind of stuff. But of course, over time, it's it gets really tedious, and kind of the glamour wears off, and you just go in and dump the bag, and it's a place to wait to go and do the thing that you came there to do, and then to wait to leave. Um, and that I suppose felt like a lot of dead time in my life. So I kind of wondered if there was something that I could do with all of that dead time. And I suppose that was the beginning of Strange Hotel.
Your description of that was so completely Beckettian, waiting to do the thing and then waiting to leave. And this book has actually been described as having Beckett as an influence. Do you see that, or is that something that other people have seen in it?
Well, I wrote it kind of in an odd way. It was a book I wasn't expecting to write. It certainly wasn't a novel I thought I would write next. And I had a fellowship to work in Beckett's archive at the University of Reading. And so, in order to kind of get away from all the Beckett, I spent a year just kind of reading Beckett and looking at Beckett's manuscripts, which is great, but also, that's hefty on the soul after a while, and a whole year just Beckett. And so in the kind of breaks in between trips to the archive or trying to work on that um, on the pieces for it, I just kind of sat down and started writing Strange Hotel as almost as a folly, as a bit of light relief. And I thought, oh well, this is really far from Beckett. And then of course I got to the end of it and I thought, oh bloody hell, it's you could see the influence is kind of everywhere on it. So
Uh-huh.
I didn't manage to escape him.
But not the worst influence to have, in fairness, now, to discover, oh no, it's like Beckett.
Yeah, well, obviously, there's that. You always have to live with the. There are certain people who, if you suggest that a writer is your influence, think immediately that you're trying to do what they're doing in the way that they're doing, and you can only ever fall short of that. And of course, influence works in a really different way. It's you know, writers that are important to you are not there because you're trying to imitate them, but because they open something inside and allow you to go through a gate into a different way of thinking. Um, and so, yeah, I think like almost against my will, Beckett did that for Strange Hotel.
I do want to talk more about Strange Hotel, but while we're on the subject of influences, it might be worthwhile talking about the other unheard of writer that you're constantly compared to, which is James Joyce. And I, I read that once you read Ulysses, you felt, okay, I'm starting from scratch. I know what I want to do now. I know what kind of writer I'm going to be. I wondered up until that point, what was your writing like, and who are your influences before you hit that point? And did it change dramatically after you read Ulysses?
It did. I think there had been a part of me that was pushing at, conventional notions of what a novel should be, of what form should be, and how one should tell stories. But I think it wasn't really until I read Ulysses that I understood that that those walls had already been exploded and had already, that city had in fact been burnt down, and all that space was there, and you were free because I yeah, I think it was just I suddenly realized you could do whatever you wanted, and that was the real importance of Joyce for me, was that you are free. If you can pull it off, you can do whatever you like, and that's not to say that it will be easy or that um, it's not going to turn you into a best-selling novelist for sure, but that there is a he showed me that there's much more freedom than I had ever thought before.
And what had you written up until that point? Had you already the desire to be a writer? Had you the plan there? Had you written a novel that you're too ashamed to tell us about now?
It was all terrible. I could tell you that much for nothing. I I had, for the previous few years, been kind of getting up because I was, living in London, and even at that point was ferociously expensive, and so I was temping to pay the rent, and I had been getting up at sort of 5 in the morning to write, because I knew that's what I wanted to do. That's what I should be spending my time doing. But of course, I didn't really know. Having come from drama school background, I didn't really know how you went about writing a novel, and so I just, got up and wrote. And I suppose there was a vague idea of it being a novel, but it certainly never ended up resembling anything like a novel. But I realized now that was just training. It was practice. It was getting all the muscles into shape and having the discipline, and also understanding what writer's instinct is, and that it's or that what that instinct was for me, because I know there are some writers who, plot everything out in advance, and they like to know what's happening when, and follow through those stages to the logical end. Whereas in that time, I think I realized that actually for me, it's all about the journey. It's all about the discovery, and trying to trust the instinct that you will find the logic, that you will be able to take it from the beginning to the end. Um, Even though that's quite scary sometimes, because you don't know what will happen, and will you just, write 30,000 words and it'll all be rubbish and you have to throw it in the bin. And that, that can happen. Um, but yeah, so it was really about learning how to be a writer, I suppose. But yeah, nothing. There's no secret other juvenilia hanging around.
Drat. Um, in terms of Strange Hotel, to me, all of your books are very connected. I do see them as, I know it's not necessarily the same person or anything, but I do see them almost as continuations, or very connected anyway in my head. And I wonder, do you feel that yourself about the novels? Or do you feel that you're particularly about the stages we look at? In Girl, it's a young girl, and in the Lesser Bohemians, it's a girl on the cusp of adulthood, and all that entails. And now we've got another stage in a woman's life, which is a much later stage. And I love that you're looking at different stages of girlhood and womanhood and what that experience is. And I wonder, Was is that a big plan, and will we see more stages of womanhood explored in future novels, or is that just how it's panned out?
Yeah, I think it's more how it's panned out than that was the plan. I mean, I do feel as though I'm creating a body of work rather than novels in isolation, and I think that
Mm,
they will always feel very related to each other. And in the Lesser Bohemians, Eileen dreams about the girl from The Girl Is a Half One Thing. In Strange Hotel, there's an intimation that maybe it could be seen as Eileen 25 years later, um, but also not kind of setting those things in stone, but just allowing the fact that I've written all of the books and they are connected because I'm interested in particular themes and ideas, and just allowing that connection to exist. Um, but I also did think with Strange Hotel, I wanted to write about middle age and that it was kind of time. And that's not to say that the next book will be about someone getting older again. But I did feel as though I had obviously written two books about young women. And and in terms of kind of exploring language further, how does that change as you get older? And because the first two books are very emotional, I think, very like upfront emotional, and the language is very disjointed, and it's very much about putting the reader right inside the experience of those young women and kind of not allowing the reader to step away and have an objective view until the end. And I suppose I thought as a middle-aged woman, you don't allow the world to affect you in the same way that you do when you're young. When you're young, everything's rushing at you and you let it in because you don't know what will hurt you or what will change you. You learn those things as you go along. When you're older, of course, you know yourself and you have a history and you know the danger points and where to be careful and what you will accept and what you will not accept. Much more, and not always perfectly and not always correctly, but certainly there's a greater sense of yourself sitting within the context of all your life experience. And I suppose I wanted to use language in that way, that this was someone who didn't want to allow life to rush in on top of her and change her and affect her, but someone who really wanted to keep the distance between herself and life, that there was a past that was painful for her and that she didn't necessarily want to be at the mercy of that, or that she wasn't kind of looking for love or any of those things, but someone who, I suppose, in the last few years, I've been very conscious of the fact that everyone seems very obsessed with the fundamental truth of what emotion is. That if they feel it, then that is literally the truth. And I'm very cautious about that. And I think, feeling and emotion is only one part of a truth, but it's not necessarily the whole truth. And I kind of wanted to step away from this kind of giving people the big emotional experience and actually write a book about thinking and thinking about feeling rather than just giving people lots of feelings.
yeah, but it's a really interesting experience to read that kind of book. A, because of what you said about, just withholding the feeling or the emotion a little bit, or just taking a step back from it, but also B, because we're simply not used to reading female characters who are like that. She's quite in control. Even the piece you read there, where the guy knocks on her door and she just closes the door. And for that whole scene, I remember thinking, she's going to open it again, isn't she? Or, but there's so many expectations that we have within us and in place. And I think she's a really unusual character in that way. And I wonder, are you interested in sort of presenting new characters, or characters that we haven't really seen before, or characters that have perhaps always been there? Because, of course, lots of women are exactly like your characters, but we just didn't get to read about them. And is that something that's important to you?
Yeah, it really is, because I do think there's a whole swathes of the female experience that is just not spoken about, and that you know for whatever reason, we find women to be acceptable in certain ways, behaving in certain fashion over certain situations. And actually, I wanted to write about this character who, for instance, was, pretty ambivalent about casual sex. That I think there are plenty of women who have casual sex for whom it is not a catastrophic emotional event. Um, and I think that's actually often quite hard for people to think about women being as kind of unemotional about sex as men are famed to be. And of course, nothing is one or the other. But I like the thought that that sex for her it was fine. Like she liked it, it was good, but it was over, and she wasn't looking for more. And that actually sometimes she was just like, oh, I really don't want to cuddle, and I really, really wish you would leave. Because this is, I don't want to talk about my feelings. I don't want to get into a big thing. Um, and I think, yeah, women who are much less emotion led, I think they get a bit of a bad rep. That either they're just cold hearted bitches, um, or there's just something terribly wrong with them. And actually, just to escape the weight of women and emotion is, it's kind of part of the challenge.
I mean, all of your books discuss women and sex, and that's always been commented on in, I suppose, a quite excessive way, maybe, but it's come to be a kind of calling card. I think people know that if they read your novels, that you're not going to be squeamish about writing about relationships or sex. We're going to see that, and we're going to see what the character thinks, what the character feels. Again, is that something that you want to put out there, because people have traditionally, I think, um, at least not been interested in publishing it, if not been interested in writing it.
Mm. Well, I think sex is notoriously kind of difficult to write about and gets a bad rep. And there's almost no other subject you could write about where people are so keen to tear you to pieces over. And, bad sex writing is somehow worse than any kind of other bad writing. And people are always much more critical of writing about sex and very squeamish about it. And I suppose you know, I don't choose my subject. I'm interested in it. And I mean, certainly with Lesser Bohemians, using sex as a tool for exploring character, I really was very interested in that. How, because these kind of sex scenes kept reappearing. I think, why am I writing all this sex? And and then I just kind of realized it was there to serve a purpose. It was a different way to tell a story and to tell the body's story. So there's so many, the story of the intellect and the story of the emotions, and the body somehow gets left behind. And actually the life of the body has huge impact on every other area in life. It's not something that actually we leave behind. And I mean, obviously the life that we're all living at the moment with um, coronavirus, we're you know forced to think about the life of the body in a way that we could always escape in the past,
Mm.
and to think about it all the time and the impact that it can have on every other aspect of life. Um, and sex is a big part of the life of the body. And I think sex for women is so complex and comes from so many different places, and conversations about sex and women is can be so fraught. And I suppose with Lesser Bohemians, I wanted to allow a bit of joy in as well. That it can be difficult and that it can be complex, but it can also be joyous. And then with Strange Hotel, that it doesn't have to be joyous, that it can just be, something to pass the time.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit about um, trauma as well, because it struck me that when yeah, and obviously sometimes the two are related and sometimes they're not. But it struck me that you've been writing pre and post Me Too, and I wondered if writing about trauma and also about sex and particularly about women in that sort of changing arc of history, has that changed how you are thinking about the subjects, or has it affected it at all? Has it had an influence?
I wouldn't say it's had a direct influence because I don't really write with a political agenda in mind. It's much more something much more kind of organic. But I think I certainly feel a certain sense of vindication. Whereas certainly when A Girl is a Half Woman thing came out, there was a lot of, oh, you know, why does this book have no hope in it? And I used to get very frustrated and angry about that and say to people, sometimes terrible things happen to women and they are not all right afterwards. Be able to write about that and that it's all right to not be all right. And
Mm.
I suppose one of the great things about Me Too is this kind of just ripping away this notion um, of women having to be all right no matter what happens, and what terrible things happen and terrible pressures that they live under, and all the kind of the weird things that women have to be constantly aware of in life and deal with in life that men don't even register. Um, so yeah, I mean, I'm kind of I don't know. I suppose I'm very interested in what happens next with the Me Too conversation. Um, Now that you know the conversation is being had and so publicly, but what's the next step?
Mm. There's a really interesting scene in A Strange Hotel where your character, a man she's with, asks her to have breakfast with him. And it's such a clever scene, really, because it just exposes a lot of stuff. She feels like she should, and she says yes, and then she realizes she actually doesn't want to, and she says no, and then she feels like she has to kind of mollify him in a little way because of his feelings having been hurt, and then she realizes she's doing this because she also wants to keep herself safe. And there's layer after layer of just really interesting stuff about how a woman actually does have to manage so much in a situation like that. And there's
Yeah,
no
I mean, I
question
think
there. I need to put a question mark. We
some
were
more of
just
a
talking
comment.
about this.
um,
Sorry.
I no, I think there is an idea of women constantly living their lives, but also being in a state of self-surveillance. So of kind of going through life and time and events, but at the same time always watching and assessing, and that's kind of one of the great traps that women have to live with, and something I think that we still really struggle to get rid of, is just always having to be aware of the impact rather than kind of living in the moment and just being able to respond as you want to in a truthful way, but to always be reassessing. Um, and of course, for safety reasons, women have always had to do that. Um, but I think it's kind of leaked into to other aspects of life as well. And I think the media obviously doesn't help with its constant surveillance of women and their bodies. And
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the other thing we're all becoming a bit more aware of during this time is just having bodies that just to be grateful to bodies instead of to be actually criticizing them is something I've certainly become more aware of myself. But we've got lots more to talk about in terms of language, but I do want to. I'm aware that you've got another reading for us, so will we take that now and then we'll continue our
yeah,
conversation after this? What's this bit you're going to read, Emer?
well, this is a bit towards the end, and I think I can safely read from towards the end because it's not really a book that has spoilers. I mean, the experience of the book is reading the book rather than the great reveal. Although maybe there is a great reveal. I don't know. Don't
The
want to give it
huge
away.
twist.
Yeah, that's a twist. But but yes, I mean, later in the book, in terms of language and everything, it having been a third person book, it becomes first person. So I'm going to read a piece from that. I stand in the hotel room I've imagined, imagining him walking home. The window, the bare bulb, the carpet, the desk, what would have to be paid for and what I could take, all dimming into generalities of themselves, all losing their reality because they were not and could never have really been. This is the end of imagination. How soon until the cock crows thrice? And all at once so much rides upon not hearing that, every part of me knowing it is already past time to cross back over this counterfeit room, put down your fake treachery, put your coat on, pick up your bag and unlock the door, go into the corridor, call for the lift, step in and with no thought for what it once was, no, step in with no thought for what it once was, and as it opens again downstairs, run for all you are worth, through the deserted foyer, out onto the empty street. Face the glowering lamp, but holding nothing against it, just go to where he last stood. Look then, and see the sun hint at itself in the east, its awkward beginnings dragging into relief the now bustless roads, the dusty trees, the black paint flaking from wrought iron railings, and beyond, into the morning distance where his lank figure still retreats. Then, without knowing if every part of me will withstand what's now coming, in the dreadful tests of time, call until he turns.
You mentioned language there at the start and how you shift from third person to first person. But anybody who's a fan of your work and who's read any of your other work will be very much aware of how you use language, how you use words, how you, what I would describe as recreate words almost, and they become much more visceral. And I wonder, that kind of, that bending of language, that reinventing of language, how do you do that? Is it a very instinctual process for you, or is it a much more sort of deliberate intellectual process, or is it both? Are they completely connected?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, it's hard to unpick, and also I think the language in each book is the language that's necessary for the telling of that story. I feel very strongly that the language and the content are completely intertwined. That I'm not a writer who's just about form or just about language or just I think all of those things have to work together, and those stories can only be told in that way. Um, and it was the first time that I had written in the third person, which was when I sat down to write in my trying to escape Beckett writing. I thought, well, try that. You've never done that before. But quite quickly I realized that although it is third person, it's a cheat. It's actually a really close third person. It's really the conversation that she's having with herself rather than me as the writer showing, the reader this woman's life. Um, and actually trying to recreate the intimacy, um, because you're following her flow of thought, so she's not telling you the story, she's thinking and feeling or trying not to think or trying not to feel. She's not inviting you in, and you're not getting the whole tale as it goes along in sequence and order. There are just every now and then a fact about her past will rise to the surface and you'll understand a little bit more. um, and I suppose I wanted to do that because I'm very nosy. I like to know what's going on inside people's heads, and to kind of create a character in which I get to choose and get to, in a way, not choose, but to, I feel like I followed her rather than I made her. Um, but to kind of follow along her train of thought, and then to have to think about, okay, how much can the reader follow? Do I need, the kind of the writer part of me is like, do I need to add a few little breadcrumbs here or there just to kind of give people something to hang on to? Um, yeah, it's kind of like a murder mystery for the stream of consciousness.
And do you think about that a lot though when you're writing? Because I do consider you a completely literary author who, it's it's so obvious that it's a piece of art. But when you're writing it, are you thinking of the reader? Are you thinking, okay, well, I need to, as you say, drop a breadcrumb here or add something in there? Are you concerned with that when you're writing? I know that you said um, when you were writing Strange Hotel, you're like, this is totally accessible. That whole difficult tag that had attached itself, which is completely erroneous, I think. That's gone now. But are you concerned with that when you're in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly felt when I was writing Strange Hotel, oh, I've finally written my accessible book. No one will be able to say that this is impenetrable or confusing or that they work hard to read this book. And, the time I read the proofs, I thought, oh, it's actually more complicated than the other books. But yeah, I suppose there's enough of a showwoman in me that I am aware of the reader. I'm aware that I want the book to be read. I'm not writing for myself, which is that awful thing. Oh, write for yourself. It's just like, well, write a diary if you want to write for yourself. You know, you've got to not write to please a reader or to second guess what you think a reader wants, but to write and allow room for someone else to be able to understand. Even if they have to work, which, again, I don't think readers necessarily mind having to do a bit of work. Um, you know, I mean, the joys of skimming a book, what are those? So, but to really you have to engage. And so, yeah, I am aware of not being able to, you don't deliver your monologue with your back to the audience. You do have to allow people in, even if it's not necessarily the easiest way.
I was wondering about your drama background as well. I know you didn't become an actress, but obviously studying drama and what you said earlier about you're not just a writer who's all about form and the character kind of defines what language you'll use or how the story will be told. Does that drama background come into it when you're trying to get into the voice of any particular character you're writing?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I went to there was a Stanislavski method school, which was quite unusual back then in the 90s, and that really informs everything about how I approach writing. And it certainly is why I feel like I'm primarily interested in character. I'm really interested in people rather than you know landscape or plot or whatever. Um, and that, yeah, that comes from that, and that way of approaching all the things that you need to think about in order to make a character live and breathe comes from that acting background where you have to think about the totality of the experience, not just the intellectual life, not just the emotional response, but the physical life, and how all of those things interact in a moment about having an itchy ear and how that might make you speak in an irritable way, and all of those things that are just tiny human traits that become really important parts of storytelling um, really interests me. And I suppose I have often described my writing as kind of method writing in that way, in that I'm trying to make language do what the actor's body does, but it's just trying to make words perform that same task, which is why they have to
Yeah,
get, swatched around and, all of that.
I don't know if I'm giving Irish people or your Irish heritage too much credit here, but I always think when I'm reading your books that there's something particularly about her Hiberno English in the books that it feels like there's something very ancient coming from old Irish that's obviously somewhere in our psyches, even if we don't speak the language anymore. And I wonder, do you think there is an influence of that on how you use words and language?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think probably every Irish writer is going to have to say, hold up their hand and say yes to that as well, because there is something odd about the way the Irish connect to language in a much more visceral way. Um, that it's also that there's more pleasure, that there's more game in language for us. That and then just very kind of technically, obviously, if there's this kind of the old language that that English has been kind of pushed onto, the impressions are still there, the rhythms and the ways of thinking about language influence and change the way that we speak English, and we really speak and write English in a very, very different way to an English writer, because there is a deeper source that's kind of pushing and adding pressures here and there. And yeah, I mean, it's the endless conversation about Irish writers, isn't it? Why, what's the obsession with language? But it is undeniably there.
Um, Sorry, my neighbour has just approached the house, which is highly inconvenient. That's what my wave was all about. um, but we'll carry on. I did want to ask a little bit about your life as a writer, because obviously it's been in you for a long time, and as you say, even as a young woman, you knew you wanted to write. You spent a lot of time figuring out how to do it, and I wonder what your memory of writing is as a young girl. Do you have early memories of writing?
Yeah, I mean, I remember at school always wanting to do the essay, and was always very excited when it would be you had to write an essay, which I would always write as a short story. And I have very early memory of maybe being 7 or 8, and having read The Back of the North Wind and plagiarizing it mercilessly um, in my essay at school. And I suppose I often think about that I from very early on, that kind of desire to be able to do that with language was there. And I wrote
Mm.
a lot as a child. And yeah, and then, you know, terrible poems as a teenager, obviously. Um, yeah, so
I
I feel like it's always been there.
Yeah, and also I wondered as well about your childhood and how so obviously every writer is the person they are informs the writer and vice versa. But I did wonder particularly because of your childhood, you had some difficult experiences to deal with in your childhood. Particularly, your dad died when you were a very young girl, and I wondered, do you think that that has influenced the kind of writer you became as well as the kind of person? Obviously, it influenced the kind of person you became.
Yeah, I think it does. I think when you lose someone close to you as a young child, the world suddenly seems permeable. It allows you to see into different aspects of life that you really wouldn't ordinarily until you were much older. And I think it means that you feel less safe in the world, and so you kind of accumulate around you the things that help you make sense of that world. And I think writing was definitely one of those things for me.
Mm, mm. Do you think that's why you became a writer?
I don't know if that's it. I think I write because it is the way that I understand the world, and I often don't know what I really think about something until I have written about it. Um, it's a kind of a way to organize thought and, you know, make logic work hard. Um, and I certainly couldn't imagine not it. I mean, I turn into a really terrible human being when I'm not writing, as anyone who knows me will attest. And it's a way of kind of managing life, of keeping it perhaps of making it feel less chaotic.
Um, You mentioned earlier on, Emer, that Strange Hotel wasn't the book that you thought you would write or that you expected to write, and we can't let you go without asking you if you are writing something new, and if so, can you tell us anything about it?
Well, yes, always writing something new in an effort to not be a terrible person. Um, I have been working on screenplay adaptation of Lesser Bohemians, which has been a very new and different experience. And yeah, I mean, it's a different world. It's a really different world, but to kind of make those characters live in a different way to solve those problems and through a different medium is actually kind of fascinating.
And in terms of fiction or novels, is anything happening there?
Well, I would like to write another novel about characters from Lesser Bohemians, but I'm not working on it at the moment. But yeah, it's kind of in the back of my head that would be the next book. But sure, I thought that before, and then I ended up in a strange hotel.
Well, it's very exciting to hear that you might be working those characters again. Um, we do have a question in from, I don't even know what to call this person, from a viewer, maybe an audience member. So I'll read it out if that's okay. And it's from a woman called Annalisa, and she wanted to know, her question goes this: sacrificing action in favor of contemplation is quite a risky choice in commercial terms. Over your career, you have often shown you want to run the risk, making unpopular choices such as opting for an unorthodox style or addressing thorny themes. How important is it for you to remain authentic at the expense of market laws?
Well, I think that it took me 9 years to get my first novel published tells you where I put my emphasis. I think, you know, obviously I'd love to write a book that a million people would buy, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. And that's also not the point. The point is the book and the journey towards it and what I discover there. And when it goes out into the world, of course, it's great when people like it, and it's horrible when they don't like it. But at the same time, you know that you've made the thing that you had to make. And no matter what the reaction then is, you can live with it because you made the thing that you wanted to make in the way that you made it. And that's the point of writing. The outside world and everything that happens with marketing and everything else is you have no control over that.
Yeah. Well, if anyone would like to buy Eimear's book, they can buy it from charlieburns.ie. They have a Court Festival bookshop on their website. So that's where you can get Eimear's book and all the books that are featuring at the festival. So thank you so much, Eimear, for a fascinating conversation. And thanks to everybody for watching.
Okay, thank you.